So, in contrast to Fukuyama, you outline a vision for international political actors from a realistic point of view. Let's take a specific case study, the specific case study of the Russia-Ukraine war. So you claim that the West wants to bring Russia to its knees on economic grounds. However, Russia's fundamental strategic interests are being harmed rather than its economic ones. So the Western effort is ineffective. In fact, in the case of the EU, we can say that it is self-defeating. How can it be explained that despite all this, the Western world still sticks to its idea? What scenario would you predict for the further development and outcome of the war?
Well, with regard to the Ukraine crisis, which I believe was largely a result of NATO expansion, not just NATO expansion, also EU expansion and the color revolution. The overall goal of the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, was to turn Ukraine into a liberal democracy. This is what the Orange Revolution was all about, that was pro-West, to integrate it into the European Union and to integrate it into NATO. That was the three-pronged strategy. This is liberal hegemony. It's very important to understand that up until 2014, when the Ukraine crisis broke out, NATO expansion into Ukraine was not aimed at containing Russia. We did not think Russia was a threat until 2014. Very important to understand that. Vladimir Putin was invited to the Bucharest NATO summit in April 2008 because he was considered to be a friend of NATO. He was not seen as an adversary. The reason that we thought we could shove NATO expansion into Ukraine down the Russians' throats was because we thought they were so weak. We didn't think there was any reason to fear Russia until 2014. It's very important to understand that. And you want to remember that we got away with two large tranches of NATO expansion. The first was in 1999, which brought Hungary into NATO, and the second big tranche was in 2004, which brought countries like Romania and the Baltic states, Slovenia, and some others into NATO. And we thought we could do that again. There could be a third tranche. And the first tranche that involved Hungary, the second tranche which involved Romania, those were not designed to contain a Russian threat, because there was no Russian threat in our minds. This was liberal hegemony at play. The idea here was to make Western Europe and Eastern Europe part of a seamless web of liberal democracies that were deeply committed to capitalism and to peace. But this all fell apart in 2014, February 22nd, 2014, when a major crisis broke out in Ukraine. And the end result of that, of course, was that the Russians took Crimea, and a civil war broke out in the Donbass that the Russians got involved in. At that point in time, Western thinking, I'm talking here mainly about the United States again, our thinking about Russia changed. That's when we decided that Vladimir Putin was an aggressor, that Russia was a threat, and that we had to contain Russia. But to contain Russia, we still wanted to bring Ukraine into NATO. We did not abandon the 2008 decision to bring Ukraine into NATO. Therefore, after the crisis broke out in 2014, we started training large numbers of Ukrainians to fight against the Russians in the Donbass. We began arming the Ukrainians after 2017. So we were training them, arming them, giving them intelligence, helping them plan their military operations. And what was happening here, it's very important to understand this, is that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. It was not becoming an official member of NATO, although we remained firmly committed to making Ukraine a de jure member of NATO, especially after the Biden administration came to power in January 2021. We remain firmly committed to making it a de jure member of the alliance, as we said we would back in April 2008. But more importantly, it was becoming a de facto member. You know that today, President Zelensky and his defense minister both explicitly refer to Ukraine as a de facto member of NATO. That's no accident. One of the principal reasons that the Ukrainians have fought so well against the Russians is because we helped train them and arm them so well. It's very important to understand that. So what you see was happening here is that when the crisis broke out in 2014, and we finally realized that the Russians were serious about not allowing Ukraine to become a Western bulwark on their border, we did not back off. We did not back off. What we did was we doubled down. And of course, the Russians, over the course of 2021, made it clear that the situation was getting out of control, that Ukraine was becoming so thoroughly integrated into NATO that it was a serious threat. So on December 17th, 2041, the Russians sent one letter to Jens Stoltenberg and another letter to Joe Biden saying, this has to stop. You have to tell us in writing that Ukraine will not become part of NATO. And then they had another set of demands that they put in writing as well. The United States said, we're not making any concessions here. In January of 2022, Secretary of State Blinken said, we are making no concessions to your requests in the December 17th, 2021 letter. And what happened then was that on February 24th, the war started. And when the war first started, almost everybody I know believed that the Ukrainians were going to be defeated. But pretty quickly, the Ukrainians made it clear that they were going to stand up to the Russians, and they could do a pretty formidable job of fighting against the Russians. So the Americans and their allies in the West began to think that maybe the Ukrainians could defeat the Russians in Ukraine. And furthermore, were there really potent economic sanctions on Russia, we could do serious damage to the Russian economy. That's what we began to think. So we began to think that we could win the war against Russia. This is what happened in the spring of this year. And up to today, we still think there is a good chance we can win the war if we can continue to back the Ukrainians with training, with armaments, with intelligence, and with assistance in the planning process. So to answer your question, the reason that we have not backed off, even though it's clear that Europe is being badly hurt by the sanctions and by the war in Ukraine more generally, the reason we have not backed off is we're in a sense doubling down again. There's nothing new here. We're continuing on the same path that we have been on since April 2008, when we said that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO. We have never backed off. This is one of the reasons I would note it's going to be so difficult to shut this war down. The Americans, and of course the Ukrainians, are committed to winning. And needless to say, the Russians are committed to winning. And there's no way we can win and the Ukrainians can win on one hand and the Russians can win on the other hand. There's just no way to square that circle. So I think what we're looking at here is a long war. I just don't see any solution, right? Now, this raises the question, what happens if the consequences of this ongoing war for Europe are disastrous, both economically and politically? I think it's quite clear that the economic consequences of this war are going to be enormous. And I believe the political consequences on individual countries and the institutions in Europe, the institutions like the EU and NATO, will be significant, and they will not be positive. For now, it looks like these institutions are coming together to deal with the problem. I wouldn't bet a lot of money that they will stay united, that the countries in these institutions will stay united over time. You can already see cracks beginning to form, and I think they'll be exacerbated. What the Americans do is, the Americans, I think, will continue to double down, because the Americans are committed to winning, and the Americans are not being hurt economically anywhere near as much as the Europeans are. So I think the Americans will continue to double down. They'll put tremendous pressure on the Europeans, that includes Hungary, to continue, to support the United States in its efforts to defeat the Russians. How this plays out, I don't know. I'm often asked, how do I think this war is going to end? Who do I think is going to win? I don't know. It's very hard to say. You can tell all sorts of stories about how it ends. Almost all of them are horror stories. I can't tell a story that has a happy ending about how the Ukraine war ends. This is why I've argued for a long, long time that the United States should not push NATO expansion into Ukraine, and more generally, try to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. I always thought that this was a prescription for disaster. And I think I'll be proved right. I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that I'm missing some element of the story, and that missing element of the story will lead to at least a reasonably happy ending to this tragedy. But I don't think so, I'm sad to say.